Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many of you here tonight. In a few minutes, I'm going to read from The Man Who Loved Books Too Much. But first, I thought I would answer a couple of questions that came up frequently while I was working on this project. I'd be walking down the street, especially early on in the project, and I'd run into somebody who I hadn't seen in a long time, and they would say, "So, Allison, what are you working on these days?" And I would say, "Well, it's a story about a rare book thief and the man who spent 3 years tracking him down." And this would almost always elicit the same responses. One, "So it's a novel you're working on?" And I would explain, no, this is nonfiction. It's all true. And the second response was, "What era does it take place in?" And I would explain, "It's a modern story." So after repeating the same answers over and over, I thought, I really ought to be more precise about what I'm working on, so I don't have to keep answering these same questions. So from then on, whenever I ran into somebody and they would say, "So, Allison, what are you working on?" I would say, "It's a nonfiction story about a modern-day rare book thief and the man who spent 3 years tracking him down." And this would elicit a couple of responses. The first, "So it's a novel you're writing?" And the second, "What era does it take place?" So I just want to clarify once and for all, it's nonfiction, it's true, and it takes place in the last few years. Now, a third question I was asked, probably even more than the other two, was, "How did you find this story?" Well, I found this when I was visiting my friend Malcolm one day, and he, unfortunately, his brother had died several months earlier. And among his belongings, he had left a very old book. It was an ancient German botanical book published in 1630 that was a medicinal reference guide, sort of like a Merck manual today. And it was gorgeous. It weighed about 12 pounds. It had these big brass clasps on the side and hand-painted illustrations of plants throughout. And with the book, there was a note from Malcolm's brother that said, "A friend of mine checked this out from the library and forgot to return it. And I didn't have time to get around to it, so would you please return it to this library anonymously?" So when Malcolm pulled this beautiful old book out, I thought, it's the most extraordinary book I'd ever seen, but I also thought, it's got to be stolen. Who can check a book like this out of the library? So I left Malcolm's house that day, and I kept thinking about this book. At that point, I knew nothing about rare books. But I was wondering, is the story in the note true? If not, how could I find out who this book belonged to? I had no idea if there was some sort of way of tracing the provenance of an old book. So the next morning, I was still thinking about this book, so I went to the internet and typed something like "stolen rare books." And I have to tell you, for a writer who's always on the lookout for a good story, this was like opening a treasure chest. There was just one story after the other, very dramatic stories of theft, some of which had happened years before, some months before. And among all of these stories, the thieves who I found most interesting were not those who stole to resell the books and make a lot of money, and the majority of thieves do that. But the ones who I was really captured by were those who steal out of a love for the books and who are building their own collections. And one of the stories that I came across was written by a man named Ken Sanders, who's a rare book dealer in Salt Lake City. And he had written a small piece in a newsletter for an Antiquarian Booksellers Association about how he had spent 3 years, he was the man who spent 3 years tracking down this thief named John Gilkey. So I called Ken Sanders and I said, "Would you be willing to tell me your story in detail?" And he was. And I also asked him, "Do you have any idea where this thief John Gilkey is and how I can get a hold of him?" And he said, "Oh, this guy was convicted. He did 3 years' time at San Quentin, but he was released a few months ago. I don't think you'll ever find him. And if you do find him, he's not going to tell you anything about his books, because he denied having stolen them when he was in court." So I knew it was a long shot, but I called San Quentin, and indeed, Sanders was right. He had done his time. He had been released a few months earlier. But what Sanders did not know, what I was to find out through calling through the prison system, was that he had been arrested again for the same thing and was at that point doing time in Tracy, California, about 65 miles east of San Francisco. So I wrote Gilkey a letter in prison saying, "Would you be willing to share your story with me?" And then I waited and waited and waited for weeks, checking my mailbox once, sometimes twice or 3 times a day, hoping. And eventually I got what I hoped for, and it came in this white envelope stamped in red with state prison generated mail. And inside was a handwritten note from John Gilkey saying I would be delighted to tell my story. So our first meeting was in prison, and when he got out, we met outside of prison many, many, many times, and then back in prison, and then out, and back in prison and out, over about 3 or 4 years. So I got to know him well. So that's really how this story came about. And I guess we'll read from the book. I'm going to read from around the middle. It's chapter 9, called Brick Row. A couple of months after Gilkey's 2005 release from prison, I met him in front of 49 Geary Street, a building that houses several art galleries and rare bookstores in San Francisco. It was a September morning, and he wore a bright white sweatshirt, pleated khakis, his beige leather sneakers, and the PGA baseball cap. He held a folder on top of which lay a handwritten numbered list, his to-do list for the day. "So, how do you want to do this?" he asked. The week before, he had agreed to let me tag along with him on one of his scouting trips to learn how he selects books. I had suggested going to Goodwill, a frequent haunt of his now that he was persona non grata in most San Francisco rare bookshops. Gilkey, though, wanted to take me to Brick Row, from which he had stolen the mayor of Casterbridge. I tried to mask my disbelief and hoped he would think of another place. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Wouldn't Goodwill work? Or if not that, are there any other stores you can think of?" Probably sensing my unease, he hesitated. "Maybe they'll recognize me," he said, but reconsidered. "On second thought, it won't be a problem." At home, I emailed Sanders for his opinion. Would the owner, John Crichton, whom I had not yet met, be upset or angry that I'd knowingly accompanied a rare book thief into his store? I didn't relish dealing with the wrath of one of Gilkey's victims, however peripherally. "Crichton's a good guy," Sanders assured me, and gave me the impression that, as Gilkey had said, it wouldn't be a problem. I was still wary, but too curious to walk away from an opportunity to see Gilkey in his element. What sort of person returns to the scene of his crime? So far, I had come to know Gilkey only through our private conversations. I still had no idea how he behaved out in the world, especially his idealized rare book world. He shared many characteristics of other collectors, but his thieving set him apart in ways that still confounded me. Was he amoral or mentally ill? How are such lines drawn anyway? Accompanying Gilkey to Brick Row was an irresistible chance to be an eyewitness. Also, I had heard that the shop was well regarded among rare book collectors, and I wanted to see it firsthand. Standing on the sidewalk in front of Brick Row, Gilkey said he would show me what he typically looks for and how he goes about it. He did not appear to be apprehensive. I, on the other hand, was all nerves. I had no idea what Crichton might do when we walked in. This, at the very least, was going to be awkward. We took the elevator to the second floor and passed the rare bookshop of John Wendell, who had been helpful months earlier when I consulted him about the 17th century botanical text, the book that had captured my curiosity and led me to Gilkey and Sanders. I was sure Wendell would recognize me, and I feared also Gilkey. So as we passed his shop, I turned and looked the other way so that I wouldn't have to explain myself. These are small, quiet shops, places where 1 customer is the norm, 2 is busy, and 3 feels bustling. Gilkey and I arrived at the door to Brick Row almost immediately. We walked in and faced 2 men, John Crichton, the owner, standing near the rear, and an employee sitting at a desk near the entrance. Did they recognize Gilkey? Would they call the police? Inside Brick Row, natural light streamed through the windows, illuminating books sitting in cases along every wall and under windows and on a graceful arc of shelves that ran through the middle of the shop. It was a quiet refuge from the city streets below, and if you ignored the computer and phone on Crichton's heavy oak desk, it could be a 19th century bookshop. Thousands of majestic leather-bound books, many with gold lettering, caught the light as I walked by. Given Gilkey's Victorian library fantasies, I could see why he favored this shop, why he chose to bring me there. Unlike Sanders' shop in Salt Lake City, Brick Row was tidy and appeared highly ordered. A filmmaker would do well to use it as a set for a gentleman's fine library. More classier feel than some of the other bookstores that just rack them up in average bookcases, is how Gilkey had described it.